Good morning, and welcome to this online service for the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship at Stony Brook. My name is Jessica Pond, and it is my pleasure to be acting as your worship associate this morning. Our minister, Margie Allen, is away on her annual vacation and study leave. She'll return to our pulpit August 29th. Our religious education program is also on break for the summer and will resume in September. Our service leader this morning is Tom Allison. Tom, along with his family Cassandra, Isaac, and Audrey, has been a member of our fellowship for 4 years. He earned his PhD in physics from the University of California at Berkeley, and since 2013 has worked as a professor in the physics and chemistry departments at Stony Brook University, where he leads a research group studying the ultra-fast dynamics of molecules and materials. I would like to take a moment to offer a special welcome to anyone who is joining us for the first time or anyone who feels like a new visitor. We hope that today's service is fulfilling and welcoming to you. Our services vary in style and content, so if this is your first time joining us, we hope that you will join us many times to get a true sense of who we are as a community of faith. Unitarian Universalism is a liberal, open-minded religion with no fixed creed that we all must adhere to. What we share is a commitment to social justice guided by our 7 principles. You can find more information about our faith on our webpage, UUFSB.org. We hope that you will stay with us after the service for our brief virtual coffee hour. And if you would like time for deeper conversation, we would love for you to join us in the small group chats by going to our website or yesterday's newsfeed and clicking on the small group chats link. If you are new to our community, we would love to get to know you better, and we hope that you will have the opportunity to get to know us. Thank you all, and welcome to our fellowship.
The sound of the morning bell calls us now into the spirit of worship, asking us to open our hearts and minds to the gift of being together here in this hour.
As I light my chalice, I invite you to light your own chalices or candles and join me in the community of folks across the world who light candles today with thoughts of prayer, hope, and meditation. I offer you these words adapted from Reverend Hope Johnson. We light this chalice to remind ourselves we are one, a diverse group of proudly kindred spirits, here not by coincidence, but because we choose to journey together. We are one, taking risks, making mistakes, learning to love our neighbors, learning to love ourselves, apologizing and forgiving with humility, and being forgiven through grace, creating the beloved community together. We are one.
Our opening words this morning are from A.E. Stallings, a poem called The Mistake. The mistake was light and easy in my hand, a seed meant to be born upon the wind. I did not have to bury it or throw, just open up my hand and let it go. The mistake was dry and small without weight. A breeze quickly snatched it from my sight. And even had I wanted to prevent, nobody could tell me where it went. I did not think on the mistake again until the spring came, soft and full of rain. And in the yard such dandelions grew that bloomed and closed and opened up and blew. Please join me now in singing hymn 338, I Seek the Spirit of a Child, led by Lee and John Morris. For our meditation this morning, we'll think about mistakes. The idea of a mistake is intimately connected to a decision. A mistake is a wrong decision. For this meditation, we'll think about how we make decisions, how we make them now, and how we've made them in the past. I would like you to think about a difficult decision you had to make in the past and think about how useful an analytic approach was. Or was it better in the end to just go with your gut? Did you make a list of pros and cons? Perhaps you've seen before a decision tree. Something like this, in which one decision logically leads to the next. Was such a tree ever useful to you? Has the trajectory of your life followed such a tree anyway, whether you intended it to or not? Has the tree always branched out to give more options? Or sometimes it is funneled down, like a bunch of smaller streams combining into a river, to give you fewer? As we contemplate this, also think about these words from A.A. Milne's The House at Pooh Corner. By the time it came to the forest, the stream had grown up, so that it was almost a river. And being grown up, it did not run and jump and sparkle along as it used to when it was younger, but moved more slowly. For it knew now where it was going, and it said to itself, "There is no hurry. We shall get there someday." But all the little streams higher up in the forest went this way and that, quickly, eagerly, having so much to find out before it was too late.
We all support our fellowship in various ways. This is the time when we invite you to donate to our financial support if you're able. Each month, it is part of our spiritual practice to share the plate with an organization devoted to social justice. This month, we are sharing the plate with Island Harvest, which is Long Island's largest hunger relief organization. Their volunteers and staff deliver millions of pounds of food to a network of 570 food pantries, soup kitchens, and other organizations offering feeding services to those in need. They also sponsor a great summer food serving program for kids in 70 community locations across Long Island, such as schools, libraries, and recreation centers. The program offers free lunch during a time of year when school lunch programs are not available. As families continue to struggle in this pandemic year, your contributions to this organization can make a real difference. There are several ways to make your donation. You can send a check to the address on the screen, use the donate button on the UUFSB website, or you can click the link in the chat box right now. We appreciate every dollar you give and recognize the sacrifice and commitment that gift represents.
When you're feeling inside out and insecure, when life keeps getting you life's daily worries hurry through your head. You don't even want to get up, you just lie around in bed. When you feel like you can't take it anymore, I can't take it. You wonder what on earth it's all for. Your love life's like a war zone, your TV's on the blink. It's enough to drive a drinking man to stop and take a think.
Just remember that you're standing on a planet that's evolving and revolving at 900 miles an hour. That's orbiting at 19 miles a second, so it's reckoned. The sun that is the source of all our power. That sun and you and me and all the stars that we can see are moving at 1,000,000 miles a day. The outer spiral arm at 40,000 miles an hour of the galaxy we call the Milky Way. Our galaxy itself contains 100 billion stars. It's 100,000 light years side to side. Well, it bulges in the middle, 16,000 light years thick, but out by us, it's just 3,000 light years wide. We're 30,000 light years from galactic central point. We go round every 200 million years. And our galaxy is only one of millions or billions in this amazing and expanding universe. Yes, the universe itself is expanding and expanding in all of the directions it can whiz. As fast as it can go, at the speed of light, 12 million miles a minute, and that's the fastest speed there is. So remember when you're feeling rather small and insecure, how amazingly unlikely is your birth. And pray that there's intelligent life somewhere up in space, 'cause there's bugger all down here on Earth. Yes, and thank you, lucky stars, you're a Unitarian Universalist, 'cause though we're tiny, we believe in inherent worth.
Thank you, Tom and Ron, for that lovely song about things both large and small. We do a lot of song and poetry here at our UU Fellowship, so I thought it would be good to start this reflection with a quote from the great physicist Paul Dirac. Dirac is quoted as saying, "How can you do physics and poetry at the same time? The goal of science is to make difficult things understandable in a simple way. The goal of poetry is to state simple things in an incomprehensible way. The two are incompatible." Dirac was talking to another physicist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was fond of poetry. I must admit, sometimes I share Dirac's sentiment sitting in our sanctuary when I feel a poem is beating around the bush and not just clearly stating its intentions. And I suppose I've always preferred the precision of prose over poetry. Where does Dirac's attitude come from? For this, let's look at a little bit of physics. So this is Dirac's quote. And so physics tries to formulate the laws of nature in terms of mathematics and equations. And one thing that really struck me when I was studying physics as a student was just the amazing information density of an equation. I tell my students now, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, an equation is worth 1,000,000 words or maybe more. Here's an example of one of the first equations in physics. This is Newton's second law of motion. Probably many of you have seen this. Maybe you've seen it written as F equals ma. but the idea is that the force on an object is equal to its mass times its rate of change of velocity. So if you want to know the rate of change of velocity, you need to know the force and the mass, and then you can figure it out. And this is a simple equation. Like I said, this is one of the first equations in physics. But we actually, even today, when students are studying physics, they'll take 3-4 courses just deciphering the meaning of this equation. In this simple little equation are profound concepts like energy and energy conservation, momentum and momentum conservation, angular momentum, and many more. And so you can see a little bit where Dirac is coming from in this. How can you deal with something that's so information dense like this and so profound like this and poetry at the same time? And so not only that, in the context of mistakes, or in science we might call errors, it's extremely powerful from that perspective too, because you can make predictions with these physical laws, and then you can do experiments to see if the predictions are correct. And so here's an example of a prediction of Newton's second law. This is saying, let's take an object and let me just keep pushing on it with a force. And as I push on it more and more and more, Newton's law would say it would keep going faster and faster and faster and faster with no limit. And you can do that experiment. And if you do that, what you'll find is that it's actually wrong. So you'll find that things basically can't go faster than the speed of light. And not only is it wrong, you can quantify exactly how wrong it is. The error is a precisely defined and quantifiable object. And also you'll find if the object becomes very small or is moving very slowly, that it's also wrong. And then this tells you not only the mistake, it tells you what to do next. It tells you the direction of progress. So this led to, revolutions in 20th century physics of relativity and quantum mechanics. To give you another example, coming back to Dirac, just from looking at the problems of trying to make quantum mechanics work with relativity and the required symmetries of the equations to make that work, Dirac was able to predict the existence of antimatter. Talk about profound, right? I mean, this is like the stuff of gods, predicting new particles, and then a few years later, they're discovered. And so you can see a little bit where this attitude comes from. And here's another famous physicist expressing a similar sort of statement. This is Rutherford, who said, all science is either physics or stamp collecting. So from the perspective of these two gentlemen, you can see why you can see that they're basically, from their perspective, sort of doing anything else besides physics is a mistake, or at least a waste of time. And you might think, okay, these are just some arrogant physicists who happen to have some breakthroughs and therefore they're exceptionally arrogant. And so, who cares? But I would argue, actually, you see more and more of this type of attitude proliferate in our public discourse, and especially our political discourse these days. So, for example, we hear a lot of statements like, we're going to follow the science, or I believe in science. And we even sometimes, if people, disagree with things, we'll call them, science deniers, or, you might almost equate this to heretic in a previous era. As a scientist, I have a number of problems with these type of statements. First of all, these statements have problems at their very basis. Science is not something you believe in. When one writes a scientific paper, one presents the data on which the conclusions are taken, and importantly, the methods by which the data is taken. Nobody ever writes in a scientific paper, believe me, or have faith, right? Instead, the attitude is, here is what I did, and you can go ahead and do it too. And at its best, scientific paradigms are based on testable hypotheses and reproducible experiments. Now, not all science can be done that way, right? Astronomy, we can't go trigger supernovae, but at its best, science is based on testable hypotheses and reproducible experiments. And you don't have to believe Rutherford that most of the mass of the atom is in the nucleus. If you can do the experiment yourself, or at least look at his data and see what you think of it. And skepticism and repetition are generally encouraged in science. So I would encourage more language. If you feel people are not taking scientific conclusions seriously, I would encourage more language of, look, here's the data, and what's your problem with the data, right? And so then you can start a discussion. Second is this idea of, we're going to follow the science. Well, where are you going to follow it to? As an example, we've all, COVID is definitely an event that's intertwined science and politics quite a lot. And, there's a lot of debate as to how we should respond to COVID in this situation or that. And, consider, let's say science could, with small uncertainty, say, if we did A, then X people would die. And if we did B, Y people would die. Even if science could make that prediction very well, it won't tell you if A or B or X or Y are okay. Fundamentally, these are moral and ethical and political decisions. And to paraphrase the 18th century philosopher David Hume, science can perhaps tell you what is, but it can't tell you what ought. And there's a big difference. Still, people get quite cynical about this. To quote the historian John Barry, who writes, "When you mix science and politics, you get politics." And I believe that's true. I believe Mr. Barry meant this as a cynical statement, referring to obfuscation or exaggeration of scientific results for political purposes. But I would prefer instead just to think of it as a fact of life, or almost a law of nature. A simple definition of politics is the way groups of people make decisions. And many of the problems we have in science and when politics mix is, in my opinion, due to the inability of those groups of people to define goals. And when you can't define a goal, then it's hard to say whether a number is good or bad or right or wrong, et cetera. So, a pragmatic reality, coming back to Rutherford, is we live in a world that still uses stamps, whether they make sense or not. And in this world, mistakes cannot be so precisely defined. Coming back to that example of Newton's second law, we were able to show it was wrong by basically taking the limits. Okay, like this looks pretty good in the world we live in, where things have masses of kilograms and velocities of miles per hour, right? Let's push it faster and see if the thing still works. When you try and do that in moral or ethical discussions, this idea of taking the limits never really works. I mean, take some simple examples where you try and do this type of reductionism. For example, a statement as simple as "thou shalt not kill." Well, there might be exceptions, self-defense, war. It's complicated, right? Another example, even something as simple as the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, there's some people might enjoy being harmed, right? So there's a lot of nuance in these things. And this is one of the reasons I come to our UU fellowship, is that it provides time and space to discuss that nuance, as opposed to, a three-word tribal slogan that might dominate the discussion on Facebook with a hashtag or something like this. So coming back to mistakes, first, to define a mistake, you have to define the goal. That's true in politics, groups of people. It's also true in your personal trajectory. And so, but fundamentally, a mistake is sort of a failure to predict the future, right? The decision you made, you thought something was going to happen, or maybe you didn't think, but one way to define it is, an undesired outcome happened because you didn't predict the future. So for this process, I think there might be some helpful insight from physics and science and mathematical modeling about thinking about how, in those contexts, we predict the future. So let's look again at that equation I presented before, which is actually a predictive equation. Okay, so this is an equation that predicts the future because it says if I know the force now, I can tell you how the velocity is changing. It's what we call a differential equation. Basically, this says the force is equal to the mass times the rate of change of the acceleration. So this acceleration is the change in velocity. So, before I presented physics as like, Dirac said, let there be particles, and there were, right? It just sort of grabbed the solution or was inspired to get it. But actually in physics, a lot of times the way we solve these types of equations, especially nowadays, is we solve them by taking steps. So not so different than how you step through the trajectory of your life per se. And the way this kind of works is sort of like this. Let's say you know the velocity now, you know your trajectory now. You could take the force you have now and multiply by a small step, and then you'll get the velocity a small time later. So you can think of this graphically as you're here, and you basically take this small step in velocity change due to the force, and now you're here, right? And you can solve these equations this way if you take a lot of steps. So here's an example for the Newton's second law for a raindrop, which is falling under gravity and then might have some air drag. And what you can see is that after the raindrop is formed, it falls faster and faster and faster, and eventually reaches some terminal velocity, which is why raindrops are generally non-lethal, right? They reach some maximum speed and then come down and hit you in the head, and it's okay. And this one we can actually solve exactly. So the orange line here is a exact solution, and the blue one is these dots here taking the steps. And you see it's off, but it's close, right? And eventually kind of converges to the right answer. And at each step, you could also repeat it with smaller steps and quantify the error. That's great. You can see if you do this with smaller steps, or try and take bigger steps, then you'll wander a little more off your target. Sometimes it doesn't even converge. It doesn't have to converge. In some sense, maybe this could be a mathematical definition of faith, is that if you keep taking enough small steps, eventually you'll converge to something, hopefully your goal, but at least something reasonable. And so this is actually how we, in a lot of times in physics, we do things, is we take these steps and we sort of muddle through. And this is particularly important when the equations get complicated. And that's the case if you want to take this analogy to your trajectory. The force on you is highly multidimensional and has a lot of randomness in it. Even a raindrop has wind blowing it around. It might evaporate, or it might condense. It might change its mass. Perhaps you can relate to changing your mass as you follow your trajectory, whether you didn't want to or not. So, in this sort of problem, this is, of course, much harder. And how do we make progress in this sort of thing in physics as well? Is, again, we have this idea of sort of taking steps. And the steps we take here is we do a lot of times what's called an expansion, or maybe you've heard of a Taylor expansion. So we'll say, okay, I kind of understand the force in one place. Now let me look at what the force looks like a small distance away from this. And this is sort of saying, okay, I'm going to take the rate of change of that force and then take a small step in all these dimensions. And you can take this out to higher and higher orders. So, in the trajectory of you could imagine, okay, this is, a concern for myself. If I do something now, this might be the force I get back from from Bob or Joe or something, that'll have a reaction and they'll do something. And then the second order things might be like, well, if I do this, Bob will get really upset, and then that'll upset Joe, and then he'll come and, give me a hard time. Right. And then you can take it out to third order and so forth. And just like, the example I'm giving of human interactions, just like that in physics, you have to truncate this. You have to shut this expansion off at some reasonable order in order to make any progress. And just like that in your life, you also have to say, okay, at some point, I'm just going to deal with some, finite network of interactions, right? And so this is I find this concept useful, and it's a concept that also shows up in philosophy as well. Perhaps maybe you've heard of a meditation called Hierocles' Circle of Concern. So Hierocles was a Stoic philosopher in ancient Greece, and he suggested that you meditate on, in sort of outward circles of influence. So first yourself, then your family, then your fellow citizens, etc. And so this is not this is a similar concept. So all of this is fine, but at the end of the day, even if you could figure out your optimum steps and your optimum step size and come up with some reasonable approximation to the force that's workable, at the end of the day, you have to take the steps. And so I think places like our UU fellowship play an important role here as well. I like to come back to, in terms of this delineation, perhaps the AA Serenity Prayer that says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So the scientific approach can perhaps inform the delineation, the wisdom to know the difference. But at the end of the day, you need to take the steps. And for this, courage and serenity are not going to come from an analytical approach. For courage and serenity, this prayer appeals to God. In the context of Uism, we might substitute community, but I think the sentiment is the same. In the context of integrating your trajectory, even if science could figure out the step size and you figured out the goals somehow, you still have to take the steps. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about errors. And the word error derives from the Latin word errare, which means to wander or to go astray. And in this sermon, I've presented convergence to a nice, well-defined goal as the objective. But it's, of course, also important to recognize that maybe not all wandering is bad, both in life and in scientific discovery, actually. Well, even if we can't define good or bad, at least we could say that wandering is sometimes productive. Many great discoveries in science have been made by accident. For example, the expansion of the universe that was in the song that Tom and Ron sang. A key data point on that, the so-called cosmic microwave background, was discovered by accident as noise in an experiment that was trying to do something totally different. And also think about youth and those readings we had earlier. We think youth are very prone to making mistakes and erring. Their trajectory is all over the place, right? They're not converging, right? We want them to converge faster. But actually, Dirac did most of his profound work before he was 30. So that wandering can be productive. So finally, excuse me just a second. On that note, I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to just say I hope to see you all in person soon. And now it'd be great if you would please join me in singing our closing hymn, number 1064, Blue Boat Home, led by Bethany, Riddle, and Tom Pelletier.
from the rolling ocean. Still my dry land heart can say that I've been sailing all my life now. Never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my my sail and moon my rudder as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the lights of the heavens in our beautiful I give thanks to the waves upholding me, hail the great winds surging me on. The infinite sea before me, sing the sky my sailor's song. I was born upon the fathoms, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my
As we drift along together, my ship's companions, trying to take our many steps through life, I am reminded of the words of J.R.R. Tolkien. Not all who wander are lost. Not all missteps lead in wrong directions, and not all wrong directions are wrong. Sometimes different paths will lead to the same destination, or sometimes we find a better destination that we never knew existed. And as I extinguish my chalice, I hope that we all carry with us the compassion and forgiveness of this community, and that it may help us to always find compassion and forgiveness for ourselves.
Before I give the benediction, which is by Maureen Killeran, I will sound the bell. May we know this ending as more than a time of goodbye. May the warmth of this community and memory of our chalice flame sustain our hearts and encourage our minds as we engage the blessings of life's challenges and joys. The service has ended. Your service has begun. Go in peace, go in joy, go in love.